Hi, everybody. As you heard, I'm Tal. My husband and I are the OU-JLIC couple at Brandeis. What that essentially means is we are a young rabbinic couple sent from the Orthodox Union to work in partnership with Hillel, to work with the Orthodox students at Brandeis. We do everything from Shabbat hospitality to teaching shiurim to learning one-on-one to coffee dates and more coffee dates and more coffee dates. I tell students I do coffee dates for a living. That's kind of how it feels sometimes. So we really are just there for whatever the students need. One of the highlights of my job, though, is really getting to teach Torah on a very high level to very receptive students, because Brandeis students are smart and inquisitive and curious. And as I did last year, I prepared this year by kind of practicing on them. They helped me refine it. They asked the tough questions, and I'm sure you'll have some tougher questions too, but they really come with me as I teach this year. So the inspiration for this year's series is that I did not grow up learning Gemara, and in the last few years, it became somewhat of a self-interest of mine. I studied it a little bit in my gap year in Israel, and when I learned it, there was this total bifurcation of kind of the legalistics of Gemara and everything else. All of what kind of informs and colors and makes Gemara so exciting and sometimes funny and sometimes preposterous, all of that was totally bifurcated and left out when I started learning Gemara. And we'll talk a little bit about historically why that might be the case, that came to be my experience and maybe your experience as well. But I've recently become very interested in all that other stuff that never comes into a straight up Gemara shiur. And tonight's shiur is going to be a little bit of an introduction to what we call Aggadah. I'll give out the source sheet in a minute, but the basic overview of what we'll be doing tonight is first defining our terms. What do we mean when we say Aggadah? Two, talking about Aggadah in terms of what place in the Torah curriculum does it hold? Meaning, how does it relate to halacha? What's the relationship between halacha and Aggadah? Who it's for, who's supposed to be learning Aggadah, how they should be learning it, and what our approach for the rest of the shiur series will be. This is a 5-part series, so today is the intro. In the next 4 classes, we'll actually be jumping right into aggadot and kind of doing some intense methodology to pull them apart and learn them in the way that they are meant to be learned. Today, we'll be using 2 aggadot kind of as case studies as part of our introduction, but this is much more of an introduction to the series than an actual indication of what the other 4 classes will be. So if you know a lot of this introduction, it doesn't necessarily mean anything about what the next 4 classes will feel like. They're going to be structured a little bit differently than tonight's is. Without further ado, let's pass out some source sheets. Oh, there are way too many, but if anyone else comes. Okay, so I want to start out by posing a question to the group. Before you've even cheated or looked at the source sheet, when I say Aggadah or Aggadah, what comes to mind? Stories. Legends. The part that gets skipped over. That's right. Okay. Bavoma says. We'll touch on that. We will. Any other associations? Okay, I think you've pretty much hit what people tend to think of. Was there one more? Not halacha, right. So what I was going to say is, if you were to give a 3-word definition of what Aggadah is, and this is going to be extremely broad, it would really be the Talmud's non-legal discussions. So everything besides the legal discussions of the Gemara and the Mishnah are what would be broadly painted as Aggadah. What that means we'll kind of explore in more detail, but just a note about defining our terms. For the purposes of our shiurim, I will be using Aggadah, Aggadata, and Haggadah all interchangeably. There is a distinction between Haggadah and Aggadah. There's an entire academic article devoted to the difference between those two, but for the purposes of our shiurim, that distinction is not necessarily so important, so we'll be using them interchangeably. And just a fun fact, about 1/3 of the entire Babylonian Talmud is actually Aggadah. So what we usually think of as like a totally legal corpus is pretty full of this non-legal stuff. So what is it, why it's important, why is it important, and what role does it play relative to the rest of the Torah is what we are going to be exploring tonight. And one more note, somebody mentioned something about Midrash. So Midrash is a type of Aggadah, but it is not every Aggadah is a Midrash. Midrash is usually more characterized by how Chazal, how the sages interpreted Pesukim, the verses in the Torah, and how they used kind of homiletic interpretations to explore the Torah itself. But a lot of Aggadah is not necessarily an explanation of a pasuk. And so Midrash is an Aggadah, but not all Aggadot are Midrashim. Okay, with that, let's jump right in. So in your source sheet, I have broken it up into the outline that we discussed, and first I'd like to talk about the overall curriculum of the Torah and where Aggadah fits into that overall curriculum. So if somebody could please volunteer to read source number 1, I'm going to ask for the reading to be done first in Aramaic or Hebrew and then in English, and my reading is not perfect either, so nothing to be afraid of, but we are a Hebrew and Aramaic speaking people, so it's good to try to push through it. Could somebody try to read source number 1 for us? Would you feel comfortable reading English too? Someone else want to? You run.
Shall drip as the rain, just as the rain is one, and it descends on the trees and imparts to each a distinct flavor. To the grapevine in accordance with its nature, to the olive tree in accordance with its nature, and to the fig tree in accordance with its nature. So words of Torah are all one, and they impart the flavors of Scripture, Mishnah, Halachot, and Aggadot.
Okay, thank you. So we have this beautiful description of Torah as being this one entity that kind of drips down like rain, rain as being this united thing that when it drips down onto these different branches, it either takes on the nature of whatever it's dripping onto, or it imparts the nature onto what it's dripping onto. I think you could read it kind of either way. But regardless of that context, the curriculum that this source seems to be setting out for us is that Torah is comprised of which 4 parts? Shout them out. Right. Okay, so we have Scripture, Mishnah, Halachot, and Aggadot. Mikra as Scripture. Okay, now in another source, in a totally different context, the purpose for our purposes not so important. We have another kind of description of this overall curriculum of the Torah. This is source number 2, and once we read it, I'd like to kind of compare sources 1 and 2 and see what we can glean from comparing them. I don't remember offhand, but I can, if you come back next week, I can let you know, or I can give you my email address and we can.
Okay. I think it's like around 30.
You think it's around 30, is it? Yeah. Okay. Does somebody feel comfortable reading source number 2?
And the one who vowed not to benefit from his friend may also teach the friend Midrash laws and Aggadot, and teach his sons and his daughters.
Okay, so in this case, what are the 4 elements of the full curriculum of Torah? I just didn't bold the 4th one. Okay, sorry, I just can't hear you guys. What is it? Right. Okay, so now looking at these 2 sources, what's the same and what's different? Midrash is different. Right. Right. So the rest are the same, but they're just in a different order. But when you look at the order, what remains constant? Halachot ve'aggadot. Exactly. So that's the point I want to pick up on. There's a lot to learn from this juxtaposition of these two sources and a lot of other contexts that we could kind of pick up on. But for our purposes, I want to pick up on the fact that Aggadah and Halacha seem to be consistently juxtaposed within these two sources, and that's in fact something that you will frequently see anytime different components, or many times that different components of the Torah are listed, that Halacha and Aggadah seem to be put next to each other, possibly contrasted. So now, with that, I want to ask the question of what is the relationship between Halacha and Aggadah? And if you had to guess, what would you say that relationship is? Complementary. Everyone's in agreement? Anyone disagree? Okay. What was that? You like that? Okay, so let's delve into that. I think that you guys are kind of hitting it on the money, but let's see it inside. And to do so, this is where our aggadot are actually going to come in handy. We are going to learn through aggadot what Aggadah and Halacha have to do with one another. If anyone remembers a few years ago, a movie Inception came out. It was about a dream within a dream. My students know what I'm talking about when I say this, but I kind of see this as like an Inception situation where we learn about Aggadah within Aggadah. It's a reference my students really appreciate. Okay, so let's jump into this. I'm going to have you break off into pairs to learn the next two sources, sources 3 and 4. And while you're learning them, think about the following question. What do each of these sources indicate about the relationship between Aggadah and Halacha? That's the simple question that I'm asking you. We'll break it down further when we come back together, but what is the relationship between Halacha and Aggadah? So without further ado, turn to the person next to you. Sources 3 and 4. Could somebody just give me a quick synopsis of what happens here? Surface level, what's going on?
Yeah. What seems to be two distinct things in this conversation.
Right. So Rav Ami and Rav Asi, these two students, ask of their Rebbe to teach them. One of them asks for halacha, one of them asks for Aggadah, and the teacher ultimately can't really distill the two of them. So then what does he do? Gives them a parable, right? And what is the parable that he gives them?
There's a good Hebrew expression for it,
Okay.
which is that the one wants her husband to be young, she plucks the white hair, the other one wants him to be older, plucks the black hair, and at the end he's bald.
Right, exactly.
There is a Hebrew expression.
I didn't know that was a modern idiom. That's good to know.
No, I mean he will be bald from either way.
So we have this man. He has two wives, a young one and an old one, and the older wife is pulling out his black hairs because she wants him to look her age, and the young one is pulling out the white ones because she wants him to look closer to her age. Ultimately, this guy ends up totally bald. Poor guy. And then what comes next? It's just important for us to understand the flow of our source because a lot happens here.
Go into Mikra and give him the source, text source.
Okay, and what does he do with that text source?
So it's a source that is supposed to be of interest to both of them. And it seems that it feels like it's about to begin legally. And it slides right into Midrash and ends up legally. And you have to have them both.
Precisely. Okay, so what ends up happening is he gives this pasuk about a fire breaking out, and then we think that he's going to talk about the legality of who's liable for this fire that breaks out, and all of a sudden we start hearing about God paying back the fire that he started in Zion, aka the Chorban, the temple being destroyed, and God promising that he's going to rebuild Jerusalem by fire. And then after this midrash, we then slide right back into the halacha, which is, and the shmatata. I think I gave you a little footnote at the bottom. That's the halachic discourse. So the shmatata of it, which is, technically who's liable, and if this fire was caused by an arrow that was shot by a person, then, is that person liable or not? So a very technical detail. Okay, so going back first to the parable of the two wives. What is this supposed to be a parable for?
It sounds like each wife wants to have it only their way.
And what are these two wives? First of all, that's what I mean.
The halachic perspective.
Right.
Aggadah.
Right, exactly. One of them is halacha, one of them is aggadah. Each one wants it their way, and the man ends up bald. If you had to guess, and this is probably just more conjecture, which one do you think is which? Which one would be halacha? Which one would be? Why is that? Yep. Okay. And
Aquarius older, more seasoned, more experience.
And that would be
than rigid and halacha.
okay.
Halakha is not rigid.
I'm saying the opposite.
I would argue the opposite, because halakha is not rigid. Halakha can be discussed and clarified, and I mean there's you said 1/3 of the Talmud is Aggadah, but then 2/3 of it's still legal, and it's trying to pinpoint what about it's taking in multiple voices and taking in and figuring it out. So Midrash is a little more.
So which one is which? So which one is old? Which one's young?
I think Midrash tends to explain things in the past. So Midrash tends to explain text versus halakha does
evolve. So you think halacha is the young one and Aggadah is. So I did not think about that perspective. I thought about kind of the instinctual answer here, which is that halacha seems to be the more rigid, the older one, and that Aggadah seems to be the more creative, young, vibrant one. That was my instinct. I don't think it actually matters so much. I think the bottom line, though it's definitely an interesting discussion, the bottom line is if you're trying to have one to the exclusion of the other, we end up bald. If you have both fighting for which color hair you want your husband to have, right?
So it sounds like, and based on what you just said, the context is it's a Hebrew expression, it really makes a lot of sense because either way you end up.
Right. So what I said to my students is even if you say you just keep halacha or you just keep aggadah, you just keep this wife or you just keep that wife, either way you end up half bald, right? You have a middle-aged man instead of an older young man. So you don't end up winning if these two wives are warring with each other or fighting with each other. I think that's what the bottom line is. Which one is which, we could debate probably forever, but seems to be that nobody wins from them being in conflict from one another, from us thinking about them as being mutually exclusive. I kind of answered this already, but if you had to say that there's a hierarchy here, halacha or aggadah, is one better than the other in this source? They seem to be pretty equal. Okay, so with that, I know some of you already got into source 4 already, the Sota, but some of you didn't have time, so I want to return to that source, give you a few more minutes to try to wrap that one up, and then we will tear it apart in kind of a similar way, and then we'll regroup and talk about what we've learned until now about halacha versus aggadah. Okay.
So this one it does.
Okay, so what happens here? I want to kind of go through the same process that we just went through with source number 3. I want to get a little bit of a synopsis or an overview of what happened and then break it down a little bit further from there. So could somebody give us a summary first? This is to prove that you guys are actually learning instead of just,
Well, so we have two rabbis, we have Abayu and we have Abba. Abayu goes and speaks on Aggadah. Kia goes to speak on Halakha. Nobody comes to see Rabbi Kia, everyone goes to Rabbi Abayu. Rabbi Kia becomes upset. Rabbi Abayu says, it comes up with a parallel that the one who, if you have two men, you have one selling precious stones, you have one who's selling, we had a discussion about what sundries might mean in this context. Everyone tends to go to the one that sells various things and not the one who sells precious stones. But this didn't work, and Rabbi Kia was still sad, and even though Rabbi Abayu usually commanded more respect and so would be escorted to his house, he tried to escort Rabbi Kia to make him feel better, but Rabbi Kia didn't feel better because he didn't like being the sundries merchant in the parable.
Okay, great. So,
The precious stones, the precious stones.
yeah, okay, that was exactly my next question. Which one is which? So, right, he didn't like having no students.
I mean, there's a question around, like, is it solely the subject matter?
That's a good, always a good question. I always, when 7 people show up to Chabura at Brandeis, when we know that we have 200 Orthodox students, we're like, is it us? Do they not really want to come? So that's always a question that is an educator needs to ask themselves. Okay, so we've established that that there's this analogy of precious stones or diamonds versus sundries or trinkets or various things that are being sold, and that halakha seems to be the diamonds or the precious stones, and that aggadah seems to be these trinkets, and that Aggadah seems to draw this broader crowd. And Rabbi Abahu, in an effort to console Rav Chia for him not getting any students coming to his class, gives him an Aggadah and says, let me console you. It's not that diamonds are inherently less valuable. It's just that people are more likely to buy cheap trinkets, right? So, first of all, what does this say about the relationship between halakha and aggadah? Much more of a hierarchical relationship with halakha at the top. I mean, I guess you could argue it either way, that halakha is inherently at the top, but in terms of market value or marketability, that maybe aggadah is really what's more valuable, because at the end of the day, if you can't sell your precious stones, then you're going to make more money on your trinkets. Okay, but either way, we definitely have this dynamic now of they're not just two things that are equal and that we need both, but that maybe one is more important than the other. Just a question, kind of food for thought. If Rabbi Abahu really believes what he's saying, which is that what Rav Chia is teaching is more important, that halakha is more important, why would Rabbi Abahu still be teaching aggadah? Yeah. That was my initial instinct also, that better to kind of teach something than teach nothing. Okay, so I think you guys actually, that one was a little bit easier to rip apart. Yes. Right. Right. Right, he'd rather appeal to the masses than teach something that maybe is inherently more valuable to nobody, but either turn people off or draw nobody at all, right? Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, because I feel like this is a little how I tend to approach the Talmud. Like, I tend to remember the Aggadah better, and then when I kind of get into the weeds with, then it just kind of after a while. Like, I've been studying Boyd Katan. I can tell you a lot about drainage ditches, but like it's gonna be gone in a week.
Right. Right. So the technical details of halakha, or the dry pill pull of halakha, seems to be something that's less accessible. Whether it's that you can't even process it the first time around, or whether you don't really hold on to it. Either way, it's something that doesn't really seem to stick with as wide of an appeal as the aggadah does.
That seems to me like the analogy. That's part of the analogy here. Like if you have a really precious stone, like to really understand why it's so precious takes a lot of time, energy, and like understanding. Whereas if you have like a fun trinket, you're like, oh, what a fun trinket.
Right, it's like a glittering trinket, it's shiny. Right, exactly.
Go back to the first one.
That's interesting. So I don't think that that's explicit there, but I guess you could argue that he thinks that, right, maybe he teaches it as like an entry, a portal of entry.
Yeah, I mean, to ask the question, well, then why does it teach it implies that if it's not a precious stone, then it's valueless.
Right.
Which, just because it's not a precious stone doesn't mean it's valueless.
Right, but it is, he's kind of, he goes so out of his way to emphasize how important what Rav Chia does. He even goes out of his way to walk him home, even though really he should be the one who's walked home, and I think like in Gemara terms that means a lot. And, he really goes out of his way to affirm and console his friend as to the importance of what he's teaching.
Nonetheless, it's still
Right, so he's saying, right, so I think it definitely part of the answer is just it's part of Torah, but there's definitely a hierarchy going on here, and I think that's something that we have to kind of contend with. For the sake of time, we're going to have to move along, but just kind of hold on to these ideas, and hopefully everything will tie together as we go along. So my next question is Aggadah really just a trinket for the masses? Is it really just sundries? Is it just this cheap, appealing, marketable group of stories that people like and find entertaining, or is there something more to it? So if everybody could turn to source number 5, please. This is the Sifrei Devarim. The Sifrei Devarim. The Sifrei was written before the Gemara was ever finished, just for context, but it still kind of helps us understand the building blocks of the Talmud. And a lot of the Gemara and the Talmud is based on things that we see in the Sifrei. Could somebody read source number 5 for us?
Okay, so the expounders of metaphor say, I don't know the expounders of metaphor. Do you want to recognize the one who spoke and the world came into being? Do you want to recognize God? Learn Aggadah, for thereby you will come to know him and cling to his ways.
Okay, so we have these aggadis saying, how does one come to know God and to cling to his ways? And how does one become familiar with the basic tenets of theology? By studying Aggadah. My students pointed out that this seems a little bit self-serving, that it's the aggadis who are saying this. So at first they stumped me when they asked me that question, and then we started talking about it, and something that came out in our conversation was maybe they're not self-promoting so much as saying, I've learned the secret. I'm an aggadis. I've been exposed to being in a close relationship with God through Aggadah, and I want to share that with everybody. So they're not, tooting their own horn so much as sharing something that they're in the know about. You could disagree with that, but I just thought that was kind of a cool way to look at it. Okay, so we have this idea that maybe Aggadah now is this very high-level, esoteric, theological thing that helps us understand the nature of God, which seems a little bit different than calling it a cheap trinket that is just for the masses. So let's keep exploring and see if we can understand that a little bit more. Source. Yes, Haggadah and Aggadah we're using interchangeably. Source number 6, please, Vayikra Rabbah. Yeah, it's a little easier, this one.
Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzedek שאל לרבי שלום בר נחמן, בשביל ששמעתי עליך שאתה בעל אגדה, מהיכן אורה יצא לעולם? אמר לו, נתעטף הקדוש ברוך הוא כשלמה והבהיק כל העולם כולו מאזין הודרו. אמר לו בלחישה, אמר לו מקרא מלאהו שנאמר, אותה אור כשלמה נוטה שמיים כיריה, ואת אומר לי בלחישה, אמר כשם שאמורה בלחישה, כך Amarti L'cha B'Chisha. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadok addressed the following query to Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachman. Seeing that I heard you say that you are an expert aggadist, tell me, whence came light into the world? He answered him, the Holy One, blessed be He, enveloped Himself therewith in a garment, and the whole world shone with the splendor of His majesty. Rabbi Shmuel had told him in a whisper, so the other one said to him, there is an explicit verse to prove it, for it says, who covers himself with light as with a garment, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, and you tell it to me in a whisper? He replied, as I was told it in a whisper, so I tell you in a whisper.
Okay, so we have, thank you so much. We have Rabbi Shimon coming to the expert of the generation, the expert aggadist of the generation, which is Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, and he says to him, since you're such an aggadic expert, why don't you tell me, where did light come from in the world? And Rabbi Shmuel answers, saying this interesting kind of homiletic thing about God putting a dress or, a garment over the world, and that's where light came from, and that's where the light emanates from. And Rabbi Shmuel said this whispering, and his student finds this interesting because he says, why are you whispering this? This is kind of like a well-known pasuk. This is something that's explicitly stated in Tehillim, and he responds, it's something that was taught to me in a whisper, and so I teach it to you in a whisper. Interesting, right? I think what's going on here is that even though there's an explicit pasuk, the way that the response to, how do we know that there's light in the world was a very homiletic response, and it was drawing on a pasuk. It's kind of using midrashic, I'm blanking on the word, not technology, methodology. Yeah, using midrashic methodology to respond to this question, and he's whispering it because he says, this is something that was passed on to me in an intimate setting from my teacher, and it's something that now I have to pass on to you in an intimate setting. And the way that I explain this to my students on Monday is that we all know that if you're sitting at the front of a lecture hall with 200 students, if you say something, there's not really great room for discourse or for meaning or impact. It's something that you put out there, and it is what it is, and people interpret it differently, and it was just said. Versus if you say something in a much more intimate setting, in a quieter setting, it can be a much more meaningful conversation, and it can be something that's kind of understood on a deeper level. And so as an educator, something that I know I'm very careful about, and I'm sure that you can relate to, is if you're nervous about saying something because it might be misunderstood, you wouldn't necessarily say it in front of 200 people, but you might engage in that conversation one-on-one or in a small learning group.
The fact that it's in a whisper implies that he has in mind that this is like almost to the level of secret knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's
and
secret.
You have to be aware of that.
Right.
And I mean, Rabbi Shmuel, he strikes me as kind of a smart aleck. But don't you know?
Everybody knows.
It's not just a pasuk. It's not just shat. It's heady knowledge, and you have to look me in the face and student to teacher to student.
Right.
This is
right. Exactly. It's something that's so deep and so. This is the precious stone, maybe, if you want to kind of bring back that analogy and like flip it on its head. But regardless of which one was which in that analogy, I think the idea here is that Aggadah is something that is so deep and esoteric and so valuable that we can't just shout it in front of a lecture hall. It needs to be passed down teacher to teacher, and it needs to be done in an intimate setting. So that's totally different than the perception that we had until now of Aggadah just being this cheap peddling that just is out there for the masses. So of course there's this question now of, so which one is it? I posed that question to my students, which one is it? And I think we've hit on this a few times in a few different ways, but sometimes a story can be understood on different levels. So, there's a story that can appeal to a 5-year-old, but when you go to see a Pixar movie with your kids, your kid understands it on one level, and the parents kind of understand the deeper level of it and the morals and everything everything that Pixar wanted only the parents to pick up on, and Midrash can kind of function in a similar way, that a story can appeal to the masses, but it also, when really passed down in an intimate way from teacher to teacher and taught the right way and parsed out the right way, which hopefully we'll be able to do in the next few classes, it can be something that's really deep, and almost so deep that it's secret, because accessing it on such a deep level isn't something that we can do in such a public setting. Okay, a little bit of history. I'm going to do the next source outside for the sake of time, but I thought it was important to note that what I mentioned before about how when I've learned Gemara in my life that Halacha and Aggadah have been so bifurcated from one another, that actually has historical roots in the Gaonic period. The Tanaim and the Amoraim, the Tanaim being the people who wrote the Mishnah, the Amoraim being the ones who wrote the Gemara, they kind of saw this synthesis that we're talking about, so much so that they went back and forth, flowed in and out of Aggadah and Halacha, almost with zero distinction. In fact, the two aggadot that I brought you tonight that are labeled, that have the word Aggadah in them, are more rare than not. Meaning, in most cases, Aggadah is spoken about in a very seamless fashion with Halacha. You might have a halachic discussion that then somehow just kind of flows into an Aggadah and then flows back into Gemara, into Halacha, and you might never be told, okay, now we're doing Aggadah, now we're doing Halacha. And that's because the Tanaim and the Amoraim did not really see it as two separate categories, so much as things that inform one another. You know, the man that can't be, his hairs are being plucked from both ends, that he really needs both. He needs a synthesis. The Gaonim, for one reason or another, actually drew a very sharp line between the two. This started from the very first Gaon, and you see this through a number of Gaonim, that they kind of said that if there are ever unclear aggadot, that we should not rely on them, or if ever an aggadah is in conflict with halacha or seems to be in conflict with halacha, we just discard it. We don't treat it with any specific reverence, which is kind of a shocking assertion, but I'm sure if we had another 10 shiurim, we could kind of trace the origins of that. But I think it's important for you to know that, because that then informed a lot of what I think is the modern perception of Aggadah. I think that we have somewhat taken on that approach to the two and bifurcated Halacha and Aggadah. And as I told my students on Monday, a very modern example of where that bifurcation actually is practical in our lives is there is an Aggadah that discusses 3 oaths that pertain to whether or not Jews can capture the land of Israel and whether we're allowed to fight for it and how our relationship with the non-Jews should be in relation to Israel. And people who do not believe that we should be establishing the state of Israel bring in that Aggadah as proof for why we shouldn't have established the state. And people who do believe we should have established the state say, no, but Aggadah and Halacha are totally separate, and Halacha always trumps Aggadah, especially when they contradict, and we don't poskin by Aggadah. So that's a practical example of where this bifurcation matters and where understanding the relationship between them really does have relevance to our lives, not just in a theoretical way, but also in terms of what informs our actual practice in 2018. So that's just a little bit of history in terms of how we got to this point of not really synthesizing Halacha and Aggadah so well in our learning. There's a really great book on Aggadah by Rabbi Yitzchak Blau. It's I think I wrote it in the footnotes. This is in source number 8. I just pulled a really small quote from his book. It's called Fresh Fruit and Vintage Wine, The Ethics and Wisdom of Aggadah. And he says, although there can be no denying the paramount significance of halacha, Judaism also incorporates ideals and values that complement, we heard that word before, someone had said complementary, the specific legal norms. Our sages of the Talmud clearly deemed it worthwhile to interweave legal discussions with aggadic material to create a balance. So I loved that explanation, and I think that's something that we're going to be striving to accomplish throughout our time here in the next few weeks, is to kind of understand how the two complement one another and how Aggadah really does come to give us a bigger picture and synthesize as well with halacha. The last verse that I wanted us to run through together is Rambam, Maimonides, weighs in about how people tend to learn Chazal, specifically Aggadah, and he categorizes people into 3 categories in his typical Maimonidean fashion. He's very harif, very sharp in his critique of 2 of the 3 categories. I hope that we will fall into category number 3, and you will see what I mean by that. Could somebody please volunteer to read number 1 in Maimonides, and we'll break it up. So somebody read number 1, and then we'll have someone read number 2 and 3.
You must know that the words of the sages are interpreted differently by 3 groups of people. 1, they accept the teachings of the sages in their simple, literal sense, and do not think that these teachings contain any hidden meaning at all. They hold these opinions because they do not understand science and are far from having acquired any knowledge. They understand the teachings of the sages only in the literal sense, even though some of these teachings, when taken literally, would make even the uneducated, let alone sophisticated scholars, ask how anyone in the world could believe such things are true, let alone edifying. The members of this group are ignorant. Their very effort to honor and exalt the sages using their own meager understanding actually humiliates them.
Ouch. Really ouch. So
like people who believe the Leviathan's real are in this category.
I think, yeah, this is actually, I really truncated this because I needed to. Yeah. But basically, Rambam, we were having discussion about when 4th graders come up to you speaking about Midrashim and, you know, what to do with that. So, what was that? Right, the little Midrash says, and a lot of the ways that people learn Tanakh is with this incorporation of Midrashim as part of the story, and they don't really differentiate between, you know, what's actually Pshat, what's actually Midrash, and I think that this speaks to that a lot in terms of if we're taking Midrashim and aggadot literally, then Rambam would say that we're absolute fools. And not only that we're foolish, but that we're doing a disservice to Chazal, because in trying to respect them, really what we're doing is degrading their work, because what they say is so much richer than just this simple story. Okay, let's read about category number 2 and hope that we're not them either.
When the people in this group read or hear the words of the sages, they too understand them according to their simple literal sense, and believe that the sages intend nothing other than what may be learned from their literal interpretation. Inevitably, they ultimately declare the sages to be fools. The members of this group are so pretentious and stupid that they can never attain genuine wisdom. Most of those who have stumbled into this era are involved with medicine and history.
My pre-med bio students love this one.
How remote they are from true philosophy compared to real philosophers. They are more
Okay, right? So these are the people who, in a different sense, take Chazal too literally. What they say is, no, Chazal really meant everything they said in the literal sense, but we know better. We know real science. None of what they said is scientifically true or philosophically true or medically true. So they totally, you know, they're honoring Chazal by saying, no, they really meant it literally, but we're smarter than them. And
the modern day atheists who go after religion, and what they're really going after is the simplest, most superstitious view of religion that nobody believes.
right, so I think
Modern day Mitolson.
What?
I don't even think you have to
No,
be
I'm
the
saying it
atheist.
would apply today.
I don't think it's just atheists. I think I actually see this a lot within our community of people who think that, well, Chazal were a little bit archaic and we can kind of take the nice values from what they said, but nothing they said is actually literally true.
This comes to like how one can interpret almost any religious text at all, and that
Yes,
it's really easy for us to throw it out and be like it's so easy to throw out so much in Torah and be like, no, that's just silly.
yes,
Of course that didn't happen.
yes.
Like obviously Sarah wasn't 90, but she maybe, but like if you take the text to be sacrosanct, that completely flips like the meaning of it, and then I think that's a little bit what this is saying. Like it's so easy to look back at these texts and throw them out, not throw them out, but just say like, well, we're much smarter than that. And
Right.
if you hold the text to be sacrosanct, it completely flips how you read it.
Right, very much so. Okay, let's read about category number 3, and hopefully this will be a little bit of a mission statement for us going forward. Does somebody want to read? I can breathe. Okay. Its members are so few in number, like us, that it is hardly appropriate to call them a group. They understand that the sages knew as clearly as we do that the difference between the impossibility of the impossible and the existence of that which must exist. They know that the sages did not speak nonsense, and it is clear to them that the words of the sages contain both an obvious and a hidden meaning. Thus, whenever the sages spoke of the things that seem impossible, they were employing the style of riddle and parable, which is the method of truly great thinkers. Since the words of the sages all deal with the supernatural matters which are ultimate, they must be expressed in riddles and analogies. So I think that this is a really nice way of kind of synthesizing a lot of what we've spoken about, the conflict between halakha and aggadah, and that conflict between, is it a cheap trinket or is it something that's really deep and esoteric and theologically sound. It's really, Rambam is encouraging us, and more strongly than encouraging us, to really understand that it's a very delicate balance, and that synthesis is an essential way to look at the words of Chazal, and specifically the words of Aggadah. So with that is our overall direction that we will be going in the next few weeks. I just want to talk a little bit about what our methodology will be, just so you can get a glimpse into how the rest of the classes will be going. I based the next few shiurim on the writings of Rav Dr. Yonatan Feintush. He's an Israeli professor and rabbi who lives and teaches in the Gush, and he's actually very much an expert on aggadot. The methodology that we'll be using is specifically looking at aggadot from the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. There are different types of aggadot. I didn't really get into that in depth, and there are different methodologies that come along with those different types of aggadot, but we're going to be consistent and learn just from Talmud Bavli and apply specific methodology to that. And we're going to be looking at two very important characteristics within each midrash, within each Aggadah that we learn. One is its literary design, and what I mean by that is picking it apart, almost as if you were picking apart or annotating an English book. What comprises the way this was written? What words are juxtaposed? What words are alluded to from the Torah? Just within almost, if I were to copy and paste or cut and paste the Aggadah from the page of the Gemara and look at it in a vacuum, what could we learn just by tearing it apart literally? And then on a second level, on a deeper level, we're going to be looking at it, the Aggadah's context within the broader Talmudic passage, meaning, like I said before, sometimes you'll see an Aggadah that kind of came in by way of halacha or afterwards feeds into a halacha or is, one Aggadah after another one. So what is the broader context in which this Aggadah is found, and how does that teach us a little bit more and a little bit deeper about what we're supposed to learn from that specific Aggadah? So with that, we will finish, but I want to thank all of you for joining me tonight, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
When every single